Okay, so I've never done anything like this before, but we're doing it now. You may have seen my previous video, which was just a short little video where I shared about how Steve Morgan's 1987 arrest for criminal aggravated sodomy of a minor was made public. Steve Morgan is the network leader of a network of churches that doesn't have a name. They kind of call it the no-name network of churches. But this network of churches includes 26 churches, most of them in the United States. There is one in Taiwan and there is one in England. But otherwise, they're in the United States. These are all churches that, when I was a member, what was portrayed to me that we were all independent churches, that were just kind of friends and we did things together and we had kind of a collective. But it wasn't until I was out of it that I realized that that was not the case. It was very much led and controlled by Steve Morgan, which we'll get into later. But Steve Morgan has this arrest. He was a youth leader at the time. I don't know if he was on staff or he was just a volunteer, but either way, he was a leader, a youth leader in the RLDS Church, which is a Reformed Latter-day Saints Mormonism, right? Which does matter because this is one of the excuses they use for him and his behavior and their the pastor's reasoning for not holding him accountable. He was arrested, but never convicted because he entered into a diversion agreement. The court documents were unearthed last week. It was shared on leavingthenetwork.org. It was shared on notovercome.org. And it's also been picked up by different news sources. The court document that was unearthed revealed that this happened, in Kansas, that it happened to a minor. Someone who's close to the victim is the person that alerted Leaving the Network and Not Overcome about the court records. And according to this person, the alleged victim was 15. I'm using the word alleged victim because there was not a conviction. But keep in mind, apparently Steve Morgan self-disclosed some version of the story. And just recently, a letter that was given to Joshua Church in Austin, Texas, which is the church where Steve Morgan is a lead pastor, has surfaced. And I'm going to go through this letter and look at their response. Okay, so let's dig right in. This is the first page of the letter. This letter was handed out. It was a paper that was handed to people who went to Joshua Church's team meeting, is what I'm told. I don't know if anyone else has it. But it starts off, to members of the local churches in our church network. So who is this letter addressed to? Well, let's go ahead and see who these local churches are. California Vista Church, led by Luke Williams in San Luis Obispo, California. In Florida, Vita Springs Church, led by Tony Ranvestel in Gainesville, Florida. South Grove Church, led by Bobby Malaco in Athens, Georgia. Foundation Church, formerly known as Clearview Church, led by Justin Major in Bloomington Normal, Illinois. Brightfield Church, led by Alonzo Quaja, DeKalb, Illinois. Vine Church, led by Casey Raymer, Carbondale, Illinois. Clear River Church, led by Jimmy Yo in Lafayette, Indiana. High Rock Church, led by Scott Joseph in Bloomington, Indiana. Oaks Church, led by Zach Myers in Munis, Indiana. Rock Hills Church, led by Steve Dame in Bowling Green, Kentucky. North Pines Church, led by Nick Sellers in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Hosea Church, led by David Byragel in Raleigh, North Carolina. Brookfield Church in Ohio, led by Aaron Kunert, Athens, Ohio. In Oregon, we have Summit Creek Church, led by David Cherry, which is in Eugene, Oregon. Valley Springs Church, led by Mike Lushkwi. It's Luczkiw, Corvallis, Oregon. Cedar Heights Church, led by Dan Digman, State College, Pennsylvania. Texas, Christland Church, led by Shondor Paul at College Station, Texas. Joshua Church, led by Steve Morgan, Austin, Texas. Rock River Church, led by Alex Dykeman, San Marcos, Texas. Ascent Church, led by Zach Miller, Blacksburg, Virginia. Blue Sky Church, led by Cresvon Penzar, Bellevue, Washington. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce everyone's names. Hills Church, led by Ern Monocle in Pullman, Washington. Mountain Heights Church, led by Kenny Bassnett in Morgantown, West Virginia. Isaiah Church, led by Stephen Putbreeze in Madison, Wisconsin. And then there's also Roots Church, which is led by Nelson Liu in Taiwan. And Stoneway Church in Reading, England, which is led by Brian Schneider. So that is who this letter is addressed to. And come back for the next part so we can see who it's supposedly from. Now, the letter says that it is written, it's we, the network leadership team, and the lead pastors. They're the ones saying that they are writing this letter. I have some doubts that all of them would agree with this, but I don't know. That's what it says. So, of course, it's all the lead pastors that I already named in my other video, the one right before this. But what is the network leadership board? What is that leadership team that they're referring to? The network leadership team is supposed to be the ones that, they're the governing body of the network. They're the ones responsible for administration, finances, contract negotiations, the beliefs and the doctrine, the leadership, the hiring, the coaching, the correction, and the discipline of lead pastors as necessary. They're the ones that are tasked with keeping people accountable. They lead this whole thing. They're made up of Steve Morgan as the president. So Steve Morgan's the network leader. He's also a lead pastor of Joshua Church. And he's also the president of this governing body that's supposed to be keeping him accountable, I guess. So he's the one that is the sole person who's responsible for nominating people to this board. And so he's the president. Shondor Paul, who was the lead pastor of the Vine after Steve left, but now he actually is the lead pastor at Christland Church in College Station, Texas. He's the vice president. And then it's also made up of Justin Major. He's the lead pastor of Foundation Church, formerly Clearview Church. It's also made up of, let me find my notes here, Tony Ranvestel, Aaron Cooner, and Luke Williams. So that's the network leadership board. It was at least who was on the board when the bylaws were last updated. I think it was 2018. You definitely can find this on the website. And as far as we know, that hasn't changed. It's the same people. And this makeup of this board, it's from their bylaws. And as far as the structure about who's accountable to who, you can listen to Steve Morgan himself lay out this leadership structure in the 2008 audio recording of a training that he gave to overseers, which you can find on leavingthenetwork.org. So that is who this letter is to, who it is addressed to, and that is who it's supposedly from. So like I said, this isn't going to be the best way to read this. I would recommend going to leavingthenetwork.org to find the copy of this so that you can see it for what it is. But we're just going to kind of go by step. So they go on to say that they are aware of the criticisms and accusations being made on various online platforms against us, other leaders in our group of churches, in our church network as a whole, or against us, other leaders in our group of churches. And we are deeply grieved and saddened by the approach that our accusers have taken in their attempt to publicly harm the reputation of individual leaders, churches, and our church network. Our goal of this letter is to communicate with our members as we face the season and to seek continue to move forward together. So many problems with this. Number one, I'm glad they're finally acknowledging some of the criticisms and the accusations. It's been about a year that the Leaving the Network site has been up, as far as I'm aware. I think it's a year. Let's see, what we're in July. So I think maybe September it will be a year, something like that. No acknowledgement of it. I don't know exactly when Jeff Irwin made his site of the Not Overcome, but as far as I know, no acknowledgement there. But lots of people have spoken out over the years, and it's nice to know that they're finally aware of it. They're going to acknowledge that this is a thing. So that's good. That's really good. I am a little concerned that the thing that deeply grieves them and saddens them is the approach that we've taken. Not the countless people who have said that they've been harmed by the church and their toxic leadership. Not for the victims of abuse. Not by the fact that out there in the world, there is a man and his family who have been forever impacted by Steve Morgan's actions. You're not saddened by the 1987 arrest of your leader for aggravated criminal sodomy against a minor. You're not saddened by the profound impact that this has had on your church members, as they not only learn about this for the first time, but they start to learn about the inaction of the men that they've trusted as their leaders, and their complicity, being complicit in this and keeping it secret. It seems like that would move you to being grieved and saddened, but you're more about tone policing and telling people how they should go about bringing accusations, while also misleading how those accusations have come out. And we're going to talk about that because this is not the first time someone has asked for accountability for all of this. It's not the first time, and this is not the only way. Going public was not the first step, and you know that very well. All right, if you're just getting to this video for the first time, you need to go look at some of my other videos. So we're moving along on this. So they go on to say, we will not reply in detail to the many issues and accusations that have been raised against us. The Bible lays out specific guidelines for handling conflict with other Christians and church leaders in Matthew 18:15 through 17, and 1 Timothy 5 verse 19. They're being so predictable right now. This is like textbook ways that abusers and toxic churches respond to allegations of abuse. Quoting Matthew 18:15 through 17 and 1 Timothy 5:19. Of course, Matthew 18:15 through 17 is the verse where it tells you if a brother sins against you, you go to them directly, you tell them your fault, and just between you and them privately alone. And if he listens, then perfect, you've gained a brother. If he does not listen, then go ahead and then you take one or two others along with you. And that way it can be established by evidence, and that there's 2 or 3 witnesses. And then if he refuses to listen even then you tell it to the church. And if still he refuses, then you let them go as a Gentile and a tax collector. And then 1 Timothy 5:19 says, do not admit a charge against an elder except on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. Let me introduce you to a couple books, okay? And I think it'll let me show you the books, even though I have this screen screen. So we have this great book. This is a great book I recommend reading, When Narcissism Comes to Church. That's a good one. Here's another great book, A Church Called Tov. Tov is like goodness, good. And these are really great books that talks about resisting abuse of power, promoting healing. This is healing your community from emotional and spiritual abuse. And in these books, the fact that this is so predictable, there's already been books written about it, and they tell you exactly how abusers will respond. They will talk about them appealing to Matthew 18 and saying that you need 2 or 3 witnesses. And this is from page 51 in a church called Tov. Multiple people did come forward. In other words, more than 2 or 3 witnesses with enough similarity in their stories, and yet they were not believed. Instead, the wounded were re-traumatized by church leaders who responded with biblical law instead of grace, mercy, and discernment. So as far as the accusations that have been on the Leaving the Network website for the last year of spiritual abuse, you have had plenty of opportunity to address this. And before people went to the website, they spent years in your churches, years, going to you personally, going to who they thought were the people keeping you accountable. And you did not answer. You did not answer those accusations. Continuing along, again, this isn't going to be the best way for you to read this letter. Go to leavingthenetwork.org to read the letter. But they say that by using an anonymous public forum, our accusers are handling their grievances in a way that is unbiblical, unproductive, and harmful to Jesus' church. Your accuser is not anonymous. You have had many, many people who you've known sit across tables with you and talk to you about their concerns. As far as the allegations about the cover-up of sexual abuse of a minor child, your accuser is not anonymous. The whistleblower, Andrew Lumpy, was vice president of Blue Skies Church Board of Overseers, and he served as a non-staff discipleship community pastor, or sometimes referred to as DC pastor, for 2 years at Blue Sky. And he's a faithful believer. He had been attending Vineyard churches since 1991, which is what the network has come out of. They separated from the Vineyard movement. He attended the Vine in Carbondale starting in 2002, formerly the Vineyard Church in Carbondale. And in the summer of 2004, he and his family were part of the Blue Sky church plant team. So they're ones who went out with Steve to plant the church in Blue Sky. And he, along with other members of the overseers, were growing concerned about Steve Morgan's behavior and his well-being. He had numerous conversations with leaders both in Seattle, the church he was in Carbondale, their sending church, about those concerns and about how to help Steve Morgan, even making the recommendation that professional help might be needed. And you can read Andrew's story that he has shared at the leavingthenetwork.org website. You can also read more about his experience and the network's reaction to Andrew at notovercome.org. But Andrew has a name. Andrew is a person, and you've known him for a very long time. Continuing about the network's response to allegations of abuse and call for accountability. So Andrew Lumpy was concerned about Steve Morgan's behavior and his ability to function as the lead pastor of the church. This is before he knew about Steve's criminal history, because that had not been disclosed to him, even though he was an overseer in the church who was tasked partly about have accountability for Steve Morgan. They decided that was not a relevant information for him to know at the time. But because in 2007, during a church retreat, the very first summer retreat after Blue Sky, along with Clearview Church, along with the Vine in Carbondale, along with the church that was in Decatur, which is no longer a church, and along with I want to say City Lights in St. Louis. And I think those were the original ones that were at this conference. I'm trying to remember because I was there. I was at that conference. At that conference, it was noticeable that Steve was deeply, deeply troubled. He was weeping uncontrollably. He was saying, you guys, I can't be the leader of this thing. Not me. And you guys, I'm not leading this thing. Which was confusing because I thought I was led to believe that the churches all individually felt called to leave the Vineyard, but that Steve was a mentor and a leader of my lead pastor and these other lead pastors of these other churches, because all of the churches at the time that were there had planted out of the Vine in Carbondale, where Steve Morgan had been the lead pastor. So Steve Morgan was the one who brought up these men and told them that, he felt like they were called to be pastors in the church, and they answered that call and he sent them off, and these were his babies, right? This was the Vine's babies. They were the mother church, and that the Holy Spirit was convicting them on many things, but the big thing that I remember being the issue was how the Vineyard was becoming more and more egalitarian. They believed that women could be leaders in the church, pastors, elders, overseers, and that they felt convicted and convinced by Scripture, according to them, that is not the case. And so they, as a group, decided we have to weigh our conscience. We cannot go along with this, and we're withdrawing from the Vineyard. So I didn't know that anybody was expecting Steve Morgan to be the leader of this thing, but he was just going on and on about that. And then I also noticed that the lead pastors of the other churches seemed to also be concerned that he was not the leader of this thing, which is weird because I thought everyone left on their own accord and that we weren't. Yeah, it was weird. Continuing to discuss the network's response to allegations of abuse and the call for accountability. If you are just joining us, go start at the beginning. This is a letter that the network leadership team and lead pastors gave to the churches. And this is not going to be the best way to read it. Go to leavingthenetwork.org. So Andrew Lumpy, overseer, DC pastor, he was at least the overseer at the time of Blue Sky Church. He's prepared to actually ask Steve Morgan to step down because he just feels like he's really concerned. There's something going on. And that is when, during the summer conference in 2007, he is brought into a private conversation with Larry Anderson, who was an overseer at Vine Church in Carbondale, Illinois at the time, and also one of the original plant team members of the Vineyard Church in Carbondale, which later became the Vine. And also who I heard on multiple occasions Steve Morgan referred to as his mentor and his spiritual father. So Larry Anderson, along with James Chidester, who was another overseer at Blue Sky. So these two leaders get Andrew, they bring him into a private conversation during this 2007 summer conference, and they tell him a false version of Steve's alleged crime. He was told that Steve was very upset and stressed because of something in his past. He was told that when Steve was around 20, he had a consensual sexual encounter with a 17-year-old that was a high school student at the time, while Steve was a youth leader in the RLDS church. That it was a consensual relationship, but that there was charges brought against him, and that Steve had apologized to the family, that he had gone through counseling and whatever, and that this was in the past, it was taken care of, and that he's forgiven, but that's what he's so stressed out about. And of course Andrew had a lot of concerns upon learning this, but he was told to keep it secret, that he needed to trust them because they were their leaders, and to trust Steve because they trusted Steve. The whole trust us, oh so familiar, just trust us, you need to trust us, we're your leaders. This is taken care of, just trust that we've addressed it, essentially. Part 9, to discussing the network's response to allegations of abuse and the call for accountability. So at this point, Andrew's very upset, like I said, but he is told to just ignore his own inner voice that tells him that this isn't right, that Blue Sky should just quit, that Steve needs to stop being a pastor, and he's just told to keep this secret, trust his leaders. And then you can kind of go on later on to see that he tells a story about how in 2019, when more and more stories nationwide, worldwide, start coming to light about churches and abusers and the cover-up, and there's kind of a global reckoning, right? We all remember Me Too and Church Too, where all of these abuses start to get, there's all these church scandals, the sex scandals. We have Harvey Weinstein, but then you also have, other things going on. And so the Me Too movement didn't just impact culture as a whole, but churches were not left out of that. And Andrew's seeing all of this. He's seeing the way that the public and other people in churches are saying, hey, you guys are not handling this correctly. He's seen the experts say, this is how this kind of stuff needs to be handled. You shouldn't have secrecy around this. You shouldn't be protecting the abusers. You shouldn't just take their word for what happened. There needs to be accountability. And so he starts to think, more, and he's been holding the secret this whole time. But he's like, yeah, we're not doing this right, you guys. We're not doing this right. So he, again, at this point, reaches out to somebody one-on-one. At this point, he reaches out to his pastor, who at the time was Luke Williams, because at this time, Andrew and his family had gone on another church plant to San Luis Obispo, and Luke Williams is now his pastor. So he goes to his own pastor and he tells him, this is the secret I've been holding. It's been causing me a lot of grief. But but also I don't think we've handled this appropriately. I don't think that I upheld my responsibility as an overseer. This idea that Andrew Lumpy thought he had authority, and they just completely undermined that, and the responsibility that he had to the people of Blue Sky. They just completely undermined that by saying, no, we're not doing anything. You just need to trust us. You don't need to ask any questions. You just need to trust us. So he goes to Luke Williams about the concerns. As far as I understand, Luke Williams at that point did not know about this. This was all news to him. The next thing Shondor Paul, who's the vice president of the network leadership board, and the lead pastor of the Vine in Carbondale, I believe at the time, or he might have been at Christland. So I don't know for sure where he was. But he flies out to California to meet with Luke and Andrew. Part 10, to discussing the network's response to allegations of abuse and the call for accountability. Go and find this letter at leavingthenetwork.org so you can see the letter that they have given to the church. They say it's to the local churches of the network. So Shondor flies out to California. He meets with Andrew Lumpy and Luke Williams. And again, they discuss this. Shondor indicates that he actually already knew about this. I already knew about this. This isn't, yes, I'm aware. Steve's already confessed. He again tries to assure Andrew that there's no need to be concerned. They're not going to take any further action. And at this point, Andrew had actually already anonymously reached out to some experts to see, hey, this is the situation. He didn't give names. But hey, this is the situation. The lead pastor. This is what I was told by the pastor. And I didn't mention that earlier, but Steve Morgan had actually met with Andrew back in 2007 after James and Larry told him what happened and just kind of said, thanks for listening. I'm glad that kind of thing. And I did have Larry check in Michigan to see if there was any record, and I was so relieved that there wasn't. So this is self-disclosed information. So he shares what has been disclosed to him. And the experts say, yeah, this is not good. And here's the steps that should be taken. Here's what should be happening. You should use an organization like Grace to do an audit. There should be an external investigation by people who are unbiased. But Shondor and Luke basically say that no further action is gonna be taken. And Andrew does push back. Like, would you hire someone who has this in their history? I think, maybe. Well, would you let your kid go to be led by someone like this? Well, that's a hard question. Is it a hard question? Is it though? So Andrew Lumpy is rightfully not satisfied. He goes to these two people and they basically say no further action is going to be taken. They try to tell him that his fears are unfounded. And so he does the next logical step. He sends a letter to the network leadership team. They are the ones, remember, who are the governing board. They're the ones who are supposed to be holding Steve Morgan accountable. They're the ones tasked of making sure that this thing is, they're leading this thing. He sends a letter, and you can see a copy of the letter on leavingthenetwork.org. He lays out what he knows. He lays out why this is important, and he lays out the recommendations from leaders, including Boz Shavidian, who's the executive director of Grace. And he gets no response from these leaders. Part 11 for the network's response to allegations of abuse and the call for accountability. So Andrew Lumpy sends this letter to the network leadership team. They're the ones who's supposed to have oversight over Steve Morgan. And he has no response. Not only does he not have a response, but there's no policies, there's nothing, no changes, nothing's introduced. And except for James Chidester, who's now a member of Joshua Church's Board of Overseers, who, remember, Steve Morgan is the lead pastor currently of Joshua Church in Austin. Steve Morgan went from Blue Sky Church and went to go plant a church in Austin, Texas. James Chidester is on his board. He tells Andrew Lumpy that he's, in fact, the one that's unethical. He's unethical for the methods that he has used to pursue recommending policies and procedures. He's unethical that he reached out to outside experts. He's unethical about the ways that he went about it. He's the one that's in the wrong. So pretty much at that point, Andrew Lumpy and his family, his wife, they leave Vista Church and the network, because what are you going to do? Upon leaving, after leaving in June 2020, Andrew Lumpy sends a letter to Steve Morgan, letting him know about his departure and gives details about why he's leaving. He lets him know about this is what I was told. Here's the details about the alleged sexual assault. And Steve responds to that with his own letter, basically being like, I'm sorry that this caused you grief. If it wasn't for the mercy of Jesus for the last 30 years, then, I've been saved and I've walked in purity ever since, all this stuff. You can read both the letter that Andrew sent to Steve and Steve's response. You can find that letter on leavingthenetwork.org. So he admits that he was not forthcoming about the details, that he shouldn't have gone about it the way that he did about telling him. But he doesn't deny anything that Andrew says about the allegations. So that happens. Allegedly, in September of 2020, Steve Morgan goes on to disclose the sexual assault and the alleged crime to lead pastors at a lead pastor retreat. We don't know exactly what he disclosed to these people, and we know that there was no policies and procedures or anything that changed from this disclosure to these lead pastors. So we don't really know exactly what he said or who was all there, but we do know that a member of Joshua Church's Board of Overseers, Phil Greger, reached out to Andrew Lumpy following this pastor's retreat. Part 12 of the network's response to allegations of abuse and the call for accountability. So he gets this text message from Phil Greger, and it's kind of a weird text message, to be honest. You and your wife are carrying Satan's cigarettes, and this will not end well for you. May God have mercy on your souls. He gets this text message. That's a pretty upsetting thing to get. Later, after that, and he's like trying to really, is this an actual threat of harm? Do I need to report this to authorities? After that, Don Carlin from Blue Sky Church calls a couple weeks later. Don Carlin is a small group leader at Blue Sky, but not an overseer. But Don says that he's been authorized to tell Andrew certain things about what happened at this pastor's retreat. And he says he was authorized to tell him that Steve had confessed before all the network lead pastors to the alleged sex assault crime. Of course, to Andrew, it's not clear on what level of detail Steve provided or whether there was any, what exactly did he tell them? And we don't know for sure who was all at this pastor's retreat. Were all the lead pastors there? Were any of the lead pastors who weren't there made aware later? I don't know. At that time, then Andrew tells Don about Phil Greger's threatening text message, and he says that he'll contact Phil and let him know that was not appropriate to do that. So then September 26th, he gets a text apology from Phil saying that he reacted in anger. He respected his, intended motivation, but he has a different perspective on the information. And you can see a copy of that text as well at leavingthenetwork.org, where Andrew shares his story. After this, Andrew Lumpy contacts two former Vineyard USA national board members, because remember, Steve Morgan was ordained in the Vineyard Church, and he started off as a church planter in the Vineyard Church, and he was a lead pastor of more than a Vineyard Church in both Carbondale and then later in Bellevue, Washington, before they left the Vineyard and became their own independent church network. And they both stated, along with also a former area pastoral coordinator, that they did not know about Steve's alleged criminal background at the time that he was ordained or throughout the time that they had contact with him. So it's becoming apparently clear that Steve has not been forthright or above reproach on how this was handled. Part 13 about the network's response to allegations of abuse and call to accountability. You can find the letter of their response at leavingthenetwork.org, along with the timeline and Andrew Lumpy's story. You can also find more information about the response to Andrew Lumpy's attempts to try to call for accountability at notovercome.org. All right, so it's only at this point, after Andrew has tried all of these avenues to have some sort of way to bring up his concern, it's only at this point that he starts to look at outside things. So why did I start bringing about this? Let's not forget, it's because the network is stating, by using an anonymous public forum, our accusers are handling their grievances in a way that is unbiblical, unproductive, and harmful to Jesus' church. And they have cited Matthew 18 and Timothy 5 to show how it is done in an unbiblical manner. And I just went through all of the steps that Andrew Lumpy has tried to go through to bring this concern to the appropriate people and for there to be some sort of appropriate response. And he has met time and time and time again with, we're not going to do anything. We trust Steve. You need to trust Steve. Even though Andrew was an overseer that was supposed to have oversight over Steve, he was still told, just trust us. Even though later he went to the network leadership team who were supposed to have oversight over Steve, these are all people appointed by Steve and who believe they need to listen to Steve in all things great and small. So this accusation that the network is trying to have against people who are bringing their concerns publicly is not based in fact. It is absolutely not based in fact. And you can see all of it on leavingthenetwork.org, including the letter that Andrew sent to the leadership team, the letter he sent to Steve Morgan, the response of Steve Morgan, the text messages that he got. You can see that on the website. Now, I remember being in these churches and saying and hearing them say that lead pastors were in such a hard position because they were accountable to the people they were leading. They had such a high bar, high standard that they were held to, that the level of scrutiny that they should expect because of the leadership position that they've been put into, that this was really important and they were accountable to the people that they led. And their actions show that they actually didn't believe this. They don't seem like they feel like they're accountable to anybody. So, yeah. So I mentioned in my earlier videos that their reaction is not surprising. It's pretty textbook. Like I said, there's been whole books written about how people respond, how toxic church cultures respond to criticism. And I'm just going to read a little bit from a church called Tov from the chapter that goes into how toxic cultures respond to criticism. And one of the sections, it talks about spinning Matthew 18. And I'm not going to read it all, but just, some little highlights here for you. Another method that leaders in a toxic church culture sometimes use to control the narrative is to attack the way in which critical feedback or allegations of wrongdoing are brought to light. And they give examples like Willow Creek, the behavior of Bill Hybels. They talk about, they give some examples, right? You can read the book. I suggest you read the book. But they go on to say, Scripture should never be used to deflect attention away from what happened, to focus instead on how the allegations were brought to light. This is page 52. Caring for the people involved while pursuing the truth with wisdom should always be our objective, even if the truth is ugly. And they go on later on to say, but when a culture is toxic, priorities change and truth-telling often takes a back seat. Eventually, however, though it may take a very long time, the truth will come out. When a congregation learns that about all the denials, all the spin, and the alternative narratives that were a lie, the church culture is unmasked as toxic. And the pastor and elders and deacons and other leaders are shown to be complicit and even intentionally deceptive at times. And towards the end of this chapter, it says, pastors, leaders, and congregants in a church with a Tov culture or a goodness culture are free to tell stories that are true. In a toxic culture, toxic church culture, pastors and leaders tell stories that are false, while the congregation either goes along with the deception or lives in blissful ignorance. And we have seen the response of people when they're being told, hey, have you seen this about your church? Being told, I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to look at it. I won't even look at that website. I won't even look at those court documents. I won't even hear your stories. These are people that used to say that they were my friends. They used to care about me. You're not going to listen about the harm that was done. And the harm that was done to me by the church is small in comparison to what was done to this boy. Okay, so I'm pretty sure this is like part 16 of the series where I am responding to the network's response of allegations of abuse and a call for accountability. So their letter goes on to say that number 2, we strive to be humble and loving leaders who shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eager. They quote 1 Peter, but they say not, in this, it says not domineering over those in your charge, but examples to the flock. Now, I can't speak about every lead pastor. I didn't have every lead pastor. There are plenty of firsthand stories on leaving the network.org, on notovercome.org, on the Reddit that has come up. I'm sure you've heard stories. You may have if you listen to your friends who have left, if you've ever talked to them. But I can speak to my family's experience of being led by Justin Major, who is the lead pastor of Foundation Church in Bloomington, Normal, Illinois, formerly Clearview Church, where my family and I attended. And even though I was not in a lot of the conversations, because he would mostly meet with my husband and not with me since I was the wife, I do know that he led like a bully. He led like a bully, and we didn't even fully know what was happening to us while we were in the middle of it, because we were pretty much, I say we were in a cult. I know some people don't call the network a cult. Maybe you call it a high control group. Maybe you don't think there's anything wrong with the leadership structure, but either way, he behaved like a man who didn't seem to be accountable to anyone. He expressed the belief that everybody in the church should submit to their leaders in all things great and small. And if they did not, this was obviously not the right church for you and you should leave. I wouldn't be surprised if there have been more people that have been kicked out of Clearview/Foundation than who currently attend on a regular basis. And I know this even amped up even more starting during the pandemic when families did not feel comfortable going to in-person services. They were told they didn't trust their leaders, and because they couldn't submit to their leaders, they were sinning and they needed to apologize to their leaders or leave. And people were just told, this isn't the church for you. You don't trust your leader. You need to leave. So the whole idea that they lead, that they strive to be humble and to not domineer over those in their charge, that definitely has not been my experience. And there's countless stories where that's not been the experience. Part 17 of the network's response to allegations of abuse and call for accountability. So, after this, they say, we deny the allegations that have been leveled against us of spiritual abuse and of attempting to control people for our own power and gain. We do not lead perfectly. We ask for grace from God's people where we have fallen short. We welcome honest, grace-filled conversations with those who have misunderstood our words, actions, and intentions in leadership and are truly seeking help and reconciliation. So, on one hand, they're saying, we're not perfect. But then on the other hand, they're saying, if you have an issue, you've misunderstood. It's not that you can have a valid criticism for them. You obviously misunderstood their words. You misunderstood their actions. You misunderstood their intentions. So they also say that they welcome honest, grace-filled conversations, but I don't believe that. I don't actually believe they're able to provide honest, grace-filled conversations. The evidence shows over years that their responses up to this point has been deceitful, has been to actively try to ruin the reputation of people who try to bring concerns, including the reputation of Andrew Lumpy when he called for accountability. You lied to Andrew's church. You lied to his friends. You lied. So I don't believe you that this is your, that you welcome this type of honest, grace-filled conversation. I don't believe you. They say as soon as they became aware of the accusations, we sought outside counsel with someone who is familiar with the culture and structure of our group of churches. We have been advised to be kind and loving to all, to pray for those who are against us, and to stay focused on the mission to which Jesus has called us. As soon as you became aware of the accusations, which accusations? Which ones? Specifically. When did you become aware of this? Did you become aware in 2007? Did you become aware in 2019? Did you become aware when it got posted publicly earlier this week? How long have you known? Who knew what when? And why didn't you do anything about it? There needs to be some specifics here. This is not okay. These are people who don't think they're accountable to anyone, not even their own church members. Because remember, this letter is to the members of the church. And no specifics at all. We sought outside counsel. Who are these people? When did you do it? Did they have all of the information, or did you lie to them about what the facts were? So these are just some questions that I have. Part 18 of responding to the network's response of allegations of abuse and a call for accountability. You can find their response at leavingthenetwork.org. Let's continue. So part 4 of their letter, they say, we will bless any that would like to leave our churches and feel called to another church family. This is just rich because I've heard this a lot. People be told they're blessed to leave. It sounds like Andrew didn't feel called to another church family. It sounds like he felt called to go on not one, but 2 church plants with the network. It sounds like he felt called to be an overseer at Blue Sky Church. It seems like he felt called to be a non-staff discipleship community pastor. It sounds like he felt called to go submit under the leadership of Luke Williams as the pastor when he went down to California, even when he wasn't an overseer. He felt called to listen to Steve Morgan when Steve Morgan told him that he should step down from being an overseer because it had some conflicts with his wife being the bookkeeper. So it doesn't seem like Andrew felt called to another church family. You just didn't want to listen to him. Also, the idea that you bless those that leave, no. History shows that you do quite the opposite. You lie about people who leave. You twist their stories. You spread lies to their families that stay, in their friends, in their small groups. You tell people that they shipwreck their faith, that they no longer believe in the Bible, that they've chosen to put their career or ambition over Jesus when they go to another town for a job, even if they're plugged into a biblical, healthy church in that town. And you always make sure, of course, to save some of the best stories of these people, to work it into your sermons, have some good, juicy stories. Of course, you'll say, this isn't being recorded, right? Okay, I'll share this story. So that you can use them as a cautionary tale for anybody else who thinks that they might want to leave. So no, you do not bless people who leave your church. You curse them. Part 19, to responding to the network's response to allegations of abuse and the call for accountability. So I've heard people say that they've talked to people in the network, leaders in the network, who are kind of like, this idea of spiritual abuse is a relatively new term, and it's there's disagreement on even what this is. It's not a new term. Another book that I mentioned earlier that I recommend reading is When Narcissism Comes to Church. And on page 125, they talk about traumatic spiritual abuse. And it mentions the book, The Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse by David Johnson and Jeff Van Vonderen, which was first published in 1991, so 30 years ago. Johnson is a pastor, Van Vonderen is a therapist, and they basically shed light on this, what this book calls insidious form of emotional abuse, which is spiritual abuse. And they talk about, there's all the different types of spiritual abuse, including coercion, shaming tactics, control, condemnation, shunning, all kinds of things. But down at the bottom, it says the victim feels just as perplexed and confused as one who has experienced emotional abuse, but experiences it from a seemingly more authoritative source, a holy source. Page 126 later on, it says, because we tend to implicitly trust church or pastoral authority, we often do not question experiences that may in fact be shaming or anxiety producing or even violating. And one of the spiritual abuse characteristics that they share, and you can find it on page 127, is certainty. A belief system is offered as inerrant and infallible, the only valid expression of the scriptures, and a member's good standing requires signing off on the whole of the belief system. There is often a tribalism in which the church or denomination have the truth and others do not. If anyone deviates or raises concerns, they are shamed or ostracized, or, I guess according to this letter, blessed to leave. Part 20, the network's response to allegations of abuse and call for accountability. They go on to say that, these people are always our brothers and sisters in Christ. We're thankful for the sacrifices they made. We want them to follow Jesus wherever they're called. You can read the letter. You can find the letter at leavingthenetwork.org. They have a picture of the letter that was distributed. Part 5, the network leadership team is thankful for Steve Morgan's strong yet humble leadership, depth of love for all, and Christ-honoring character from the beginning of this network of churches. We believe that he is called, gifted, and qualified to continue to lead this network, and we reaffirm our commitment to serve alongside him in his work. So Steve Morgan is the president of the network leadership team. So did Steve Morgan... did he disclose his alleged crime to the people who ordained him as a pastor? When did Steve Morgan tell you of his arrest for aggravated criminal sodomy of a minor? You say that you serve alongside him. Do you believe that you must obey him as your leader? Do you believe that if he asks you to put your child in public school, even though you felt convicted by God to homeschool your children, that you must obey him, or you actually are in sin and no longer believing in biblical leadership? Do you believe that if he tells you to eat something that you despise, that you must do it? Do you believe it's your role as the network leadership board to not even listen to concerns that people have about him? And then in this letter here, as a lead pastor and the president of the network leadership board, did he himself write that he has about his strong yet humble leadership, or did he sit that part out? I'm just some questions that I have here. Now, there's plenty of stories about how the network believes that you are to follow your leaders in all things great and small. And you can listen to audio clips where it is basically instructed to overseers that their main job is to protect the lead pastor, to protect them. And their version of accountability is just really twisted. I encourage you to go to leavingthenetwork.org and listening to the audio clip. If you can't, if listening to them preaching and teaching is hard for you, because it is hard, they also, I believe, have a transcript of what, and you can just read it, and then you don't have to listen to their voices. Part 21, the network's response to allegations of abuse and call for accountability. So they go on to say we are aware of the publishing of a distorted version of Steve Morgan's sin from before he was a follower of Jesus over 30 years ago. While we do not condone the sin, we affirm that Steve dealt with it properly before he was a Christian. The court record of the arrest is on the website leavingthenetwork.org, and this is not something they typed up. It's straight from the the courthouse. Okay, they actually have the case number, and you can go to the website and you can look it up yourself. So if you don't believe, if you think the Leaving the Network website and notovercome.com, who Jeff Irwin, who got the copy of the court records, if you think maybe they doctored it or changed it somehow, feel free to get the copy yourself and read it from the direct source. So I don't know which version of this is distorted. From what I understand, the only person who distorted the facts about this was Steve Morgan himself, because it seems like what he confessed to was something that involved a 17-year-old, and he stated that it was consensual. And when the facts came out, it was the alleged sodomy of a minor under 16, and someone close to the victim has told us that the person was 15 at the time, that Steve Morgan was a youth leader in the RLDS church. I don't know if he was on staff or if he was a volunteer. It doesn't matter. There's definitely a power dynamic there, and he used his position as a spiritual leader in a church to abuse a child, allegedly. That wasn't enough to prompt more questions, to open yourself up to outside investigation. That didn't cause you to believe that he was disqualified to be a lead pastor, to be the network leader, the leader over 26 different churches. So which part of the court documents were distorted? Again, we like specifics, please. Your church members deserve specifics. Exactly how did he deal with it? Again, specifics. It's very, very vague. The people that you serve deserve to have some answers here, because this is not it. Part 22 of the network's response to allegations of abuse and call for accountability. Sorry if you hear my dog whining in the background. It's now past midnight and he thinks I should not be out here. I really shouldn't be. I should be going to bed, but I just want to get this done. So we already talked about the distortion part. He says, the letter says, after becoming a Christian, Steve also confessed all of his past sin to several fellow overseers and friends. So which people exactly knew of the arrest for the alleged criminal aggravated sodomy of a child while he was a leader in the RLDS church? Yeah. I mean, the church he was ordained in didn't know. Those leaders, his lead pastor didn't know. The people on that, they didn't know. But I'd like to know who knew. Sadly, a former overseer has taken his confession and weaponized it in an attempt to discredit and shame him. No, those are not the motives for people going public. Those are not the motives. And that is just, they're attacking, again, the character of Andrew. And he's been very clear about what his motives are. His motives are to care for the church. He loves the church. To protect people. To protect the members of the church. To protect the pastors. To protect the staff. To make sure that you're acting rightly. And first and foremost, the needs of the victim and the victim's family needs to be considered. And all the victims of spiritual abuse in this church. Do you know how this would not be able to be weaponized against you? If you had been honest and transparent from the beginning, if you had submitted to scrutiny that is expected from the high standard of being not only a lead pastor, but the network leader. So if you had done that, if you had acted with integrity, if all of you had acted with integrity from the very beginning, this wouldn't be some big secret that can be weaponized against you. The reason that you feel attacked is because your attempts to cover up sin, your attempts to just gloss on over that to protect your power. This is what it looks like, and I'm telling you what it looks like. You're the ones who have done this to yourselves. Part 23 of the network's response to allegations of abuse and call for accountability. The letter goes on to say, that we believe all of Steve's sin has been forgiven and forgotten by God, and they list some scripture references. No one is saying that Steve is beyond forgiveness for this sin, a reconciliation to God. No one's saying that. There's a difference between being forgiven and being allowed to continue in a role with such power and influence in the church. This particular case of abuse occurred in a church youth group setting or youth setting in which Steve was an older leader with power and influence over the alleged vulnerable minor victim. The fact that people who are supposed to have oversight over Steve have come and said, I don't think we're handling this correctly. They're not saying that Steve can't be forgiven. That's not the point. There's a difference. And any expert on church abuse will tell you that there's a difference. And I think you know that there's a difference. Then they say, furthermore, he has continued to walk in character, integrity, and purity since he became a follower of Jesus and a leader in the church. How do you know? Because Steve told you so? You just believed him? How do you know there's not other victims? How do you know that he does what he said he did? You've refused to submit to an unbiased external investigation. So I don't get how you could just say that. They say Steve has been faithfully married for 27 years to his wife, and I'm not going to say her name here. They have raised 4 healthy children together who are all actively following Jesus. So we have plenty of examples of abusers who are married with children. I don't really know what your point is. So, okay. Sadly, we are aware of others in the anonymous group behind the accusations that are now exposing the previous sins of other leaders in our network as well. I'm exposing the sins of other leaders right now. The network leadership board and the lead pastors have known about this, and they have chosen to protect Steve over the protection of the churches that have been the flock that has been entrusted to them. The moral failure of the inaction of these leaders is obvious to anyone who is not blinded by their loyalty to Steve. So I don't know what other accusations you're worried about coming out, but I'm accusing you right now of a moral failure that you need to answer to. Part 24 on the network's response to allegations of abuse and the call for accountability. So they say, we believe it is cruel, evil, and the antithesis of the gospel message to dig up and disclose a person's sin that has already been dealt with in a biblical manner. This is a great offense against the cross of Jesus Christ. Again, this does not look like it's being dealt with in a biblical manner. And Jeff's website, notovercome.org, Jeff Irwin's website, you can see the way they've responded to Andrew Lumpy's concerns. Also, so many of us who have spoken up about the spiritual abuse that we've experienced, we do not feel like they've been dealt with in a biblical manner, and there's no accountability. There's no accountability. So to call people who are calling for accountability and for an investigation and for safeguards to put in place to make sure that children are protected, to call it cruel, evil, an antithesis of the gospel message, to go public, it's just, I don't understand. I don't. And then it goes on, lastly, while many Christians, churches, and church leaders around the globe are facing a season of persecution, we trust that the Lord is allowing this to ultimately refine and purify us, our churches, and our faith for what He has planned for our future. We will continue to seek and trust Him for the strength, guidance, provision, and protection that we need to follow Him in this life and fulfill His purpose in this world. Way to make yourselves the victim. You're just so persecuted So many churches are having a season of persecution. If you think the last few years where churches are having to answer for the abuses that they've done is oppression, you're missing the mark. You just really are. Being called to be accountable for what you've done is not oppression. You're not being victimized here. You are not the victim. Steve Morgan is not the victim. There's a real victim out there. And there's lots of other victims of what this church has done. And you didn't mention that victim once of the alleged crime that Steve Morgan committed against a child. You didn't mention that person once. I have a lot more to say, and I will be saying it, but it's late. I'm going to bed. But I wanted to respond to this letter that was distributed to at least Joshua Church, the church that Steve Morgan is the lead pastor of.